Hey, what's up guys? Today we're going to talk about Lan Yan, a brand new 4-star character released in version 5.3. Lan Yan is the first anemo shielder and genuinely a great character and support overall who isn't dependent on high investment, constellations, or anything like that. Because of this, we're going to talk about Lan Yan, how good she is, and also how to build her, covering everything you need to know about Lan Yan, her best weapons, teams, artifacts, constellations, and much more. Before we begin, however, I want you guys to know that I do stream most nights on Twitch, link in the description if you're interested, and with that being said, let's get right into it. Alright, now starting things off, what does Lan Yan actually do? Firstly, Lan Yan's elemental skill is going to be the main part of her kit. This is a pretty straightforward ability. When you use it, Lan Yan will dash forward, making contact with her target, leaping back into the air, and gaining a shield. When she's midair, Lan Yan can do an attack by either pressing her skill again or pressing normal attack, shooting rings at an enemy, dealing some anemo damage, and then floating back down. Also worth noting that through her skill's attack, as Lan Yan shoots a ring at enemies, it'll actually bounce between the enemies you're fighting, allowing you to potentially swirl multiple different enemies at the same time, which is quite nice for multi-targeted content. It's a pretty straightforward ability that acts as a dash, allows you to swirl with the attack that you fire in midair, and especially it gives you a powerful shield. Now the shield you gain is actually especially efficient at absorbing anemo damage, and the exact strength will scale on your Lan Yan's attack. So it's an attack scaling shield, which is surprisingly new and unique, and the shield lasts for 12.5 seconds on a 16-second cooldown, so there is some downtime there. Also, something interesting and important to note about this ability is that Lan Yan's shield actually snapshots, meaning that whatever her attack is when she uses her skill will be the attack factored in to how strong her shield is. This means that with attack buffers like Bennett on your team, Lan Yan's shield can get much stronger. Once again though, we will cover exactly how strong her shield is in the next section. With that in mind, this shield can actually be more interesting than you might think. In fact, while the base shield is decent and is especially efficient at absorbing anemo damage, through Lan Yan's first ascension passive, she can actually infuse her shield with either hydro, pyro, cryo, or electro if the dash from her skill hits a target and interacts with one of these elements. If you do manage to infuse her skill with said element, the shield will be converted to a shield of that corresponding element and will absorb that element's damage with 250% efficiency. This makes her shield quite flexible, and it can be very powerful at absorbing specific elemental damage of whatever element your shield is infused with. Now for just how strong her shield is, I will cover this in the very next section, but note that her shield can range from either decent to really strong depending on the situation and also on your constellations. Outside of that, you should know that this passive will also give her skill some more damage when her shield is infused with a specific element, doing damage of said element type that is considered elemental skill damage. Outside of that, you should know that you can hold Lan Yan's elemental skill, which can be nice for either exploration or repositioning. Next up, for Lan Yan's burst, this is a pretty straightforward ability. Lan Yan will pull in nearby opponents and deal 3 hits of anemo damage that have an okay scaling. This is an ability that has a 15-second cooldown and a 60 energy cost, and it's mostly used for a bit of displacement, knocking up enemies and somewhat grouping them together if they're enemies that can be displaced. While it isn't the strongest form of grouping, it definitely is a bonus that adds up, making it an ability that you can use if you need help grouping up certain enemies. So while it isn't worth prioritizing, it is worth being mindful of and using it either when available or when necessary, depending on your playstyle. Outside of that, for Lan Yan's second ascension passive, this will give both her skill and her burst damage an additional elemental mastery scaling. In fact, her skill and burst will do more damage equal to 309 and 774% of Lan Yan's elemental mastery respectively. What this means in practice is that building elemental mastery, while it's not going to be your general build because her shield still scales on attack, and obviously so do her abilities, but it will give both her skill and burst more damage if you are building elemental mastery in order to maximize Lan Yan's swirl damage. This will mostly be the case if you are playing Lan Yan on field as a driver in a team where she's trying to use her anemo infused normal attacks to swirl as much as possible. This won't be her general playstyle, but it is one that we will cover, so it's a nice bonus passive that helps certain teams. Something else I wanted to mention here that I kind of just touched on, and that's implicit with her being a catalyst, is that because she's an anemo catalyst user, this means that her normal charge and plunge attacks will naturally be infused with anemo, meaning that you can use her from on field or can weave in some normal attacks on her if you want to apply a bit more anemo and trigger some swirls on your Lan Yan. Lastly, while just an exploration passive, it is worth noting that crystal flies and other animals won't get scared when Lan Yan's in your party, which is nice for quality of life. Outside of that, for Lan Yan's talent priority, as a general shielder, you can genuinely just focus on leveling your skill to get a stronger and more comfy shield as your main priority. Outside of that, it's okay to keep Lan Yan at low investment, as we'll see, but leveling her burst will give it more damage, so that's something you can do as well. I would would say that it's optional, especially if you're just using Lan Yan as a shield bot, as again, her burst is nice but not necessary. And you can ignore her normal attacks generally speaking, unless you plan on using her as a main DPS. I will say though that if you are using Lan Yan from on field, leveling her up all the way to 90 will be highly recommended to get the most damage out of the swirl reactions that you're triggering. Alright, now moving on, let's talk about Lan Yan's playstyle, her shield strength, and also her value overall. Firstly, let me say that playstyle wise, she's very straightforward. Generally, for most people, Lan Yan will be a 2-in-1 anemo buffer and shielder. You'll get big buffs through her artifact set, notably the Verdescent Venerer, and also a supportive weapon, while giving your team a comfy shield through her elemental skill. For those reasons, Lan Yan's a character who really doesn't need the most field time or even investment for that matter, but more on that later. And all you need to do on Lan Yan is give your team a shield by using your skill, doing a normal attack when you're mid-air to trigger a swirl, which will then enable you to buff your team through the Verdescent Venerer set, decreasing the resistance of whatever element you swirl. And then you can swap out, and that's really it. You can also use your burst for some grouping and a bit of damage, and while your burst is definitely nice and gets more valuable with your 4th constellation, which will give elemental mastery to your team, especially without it, bursting is not even mandatory. It can be nice to use if you have it, but especially if you don't have her 4th constellation, really just using her skill to get a shield and trigger a swirl is more than enough to make her a valuable support. Another playstyle you can run though is a Lan Yan on field because she is an anemo catalyst. This means her attacks will be anemo, allowing her to trigger some swirls from on field, building elemental mastery, leveling her to 90, and getting some damage from her on field swirling while also buffing your team and giving you a shield. This can be viable in some taser or aggravate teams, or teams where you have off-field elemental application if you have no one who can be used on field. What I will say, however, is that in these teams, someone like Sucrose will provide you with more damage, more buffs, but what Lan Yan gives you is defensive utility, so she can be a viable on-field option as well. Now, regarding Lan Yan's value, let's talk about a few things. Firstly, about her shield strength, you should know that it can vary heavily. Lan Yan's shield as a baseline might not seem that strong. In fact, if you don't manage to infuse it with any element, it really is just fine. It's an okay shield, but it's not as good as the strong shielders, unless you're taking anemo damage, of course, where your shield is really efficient. This shield is still sufficient though, which is nice as the strength of your shield is not everything when it comes to choosing a defensive support option. With that said, Lan Yan's shield can get a lot stronger. Firstly, through her Ascension 1 passive, if Lan Yan's dash interacts with a swirlable element, Hydro, Pyro, Cryo, or Electro, as we saw in the talent section, your shield will get much stronger at absorbing damage of the corresponding element. For those reasons, if for example you're fighting a Hydro enemy and your shield gets infused with Hydro, your shield can potentially be even stronger than someone like Zhongli's. On top of just that, Lan Yan's 2nd constellation, which we'll talk about later, gives her a way to restore her shield's HP, provided it gets hit but not broken in one hit. In fact, with C2, if your shield doesn't just break, you can keep refreshing it with your normal attacks, and the amount of damage your shield can absorb can be astronomical and make it a really strong shield. Additionally, as I mentioned earlier in the video, and something that was discovered after more testing was done, is that Lan Yan's shield does snapshot, and quite a few teams will have attack buffers like Bennett alongside Lan Yan, which can help her get a lot more attack and therefore a much stronger shield. This can make your shield just a lot stronger passively if you're using Bennett's burst before Lan Yan. Because of this, while not every team will have Bennett, it's just another way to make her shield a lot stronger in teams that might already want to use Bennett for the huge attack buffs that he gives you. If you want more information, I'll put some rough calculations on screen now, showing Lan Yan's shield strength compared to a few other characters. Now keep in mind there are a lot of assumptions here, and still for universal shield strength, someone like Zhongli will be king, but as you can see, Lan Yan, against the element that her shield is strong against, or with her C2, or even just with Bennett's attack buff, her shield can be genuinely very strong, on top of being decent at a baseline, once again having a shield that ranges from okay to really good. Keep in mind also that the exact value of Lan Yan's 2nd constellation is inconsistent in the sense that it varies from enemy to enemy, as if your shield gets one-shotted, it breaks, but if it doesn't, you can kind of keep regenning it, making it effectively stronger. A big thanks to Lit for these calculations, and again, reminder that Lan Yan also has a lot of offensive utility that she gives you on top of just her shield, so shield strength isn't everything, although hers can be quite good, but it varies based on your team, build, and situation. Now, this brings me to my next point, which is talking about Lan Yan's value as a character. Well, firstly, it's important to mention that Lan Yan is the first anemo shielder. While there are anemo healers out there, such as Jean, Sayu, and Chan Yun, having a character that can provide you a form of defensive utility, a shield that prevents you from getting interrupted or even taking damage, on top of also giving you buffs by nature of being anemo and being able to run the Verdescent Venerer set, which is one of the most broken supportive sets in the game, can be quite valuable. On top of just that, she's a catalyst, which notoriously has great support options compared to other weapon types. Being a catalyst also also allows her to use her on-field normal attacks to apply an element if that is relevant to your team. But even without that, just being a catalyst, an anemo character, and also a shielder gives her a lot of different benefits in one character. She is definitely a sort of 2-in-1 anemo buffer and also shielder who can fit in teams where you want defensive utility but also want to increase your damage and are running a character that deals either hydro, pyro, cryo, electro, or multiple of said elements. So to emphasize, she's not someone that is inherently broken or anything like that, but she's someone who is very strong, a really good 4-star in my opinion, that we can get for free through the Lantern Rite event if you want to choose her, and who also, crucially, is good at low investment and is not dependent on any constellations. And so overall, I'm very happy with the character, a good 4-star for those who want a shielder that's also an anemo support. Alright, now with that out of the way, let's talk about how to build Lan Yan. Firstly, for your artifact sets, it is very straightforward. It is no secret by now that the Verdescent Venerer set is pretty broken, and one of the reasons why anemo supports are so strong is the set I mentioned earlier in the video, and it's what you should run on Lan Yan basically all of the time. This set will buff your swirl and anemo damage, but especially it will also shred the resistance of any element you swirl by 40% of that specific element. This means you can reduce the resistance of pyro, hydro, cryo, or electro, provided you are swirling that, increasing your team's damage significantly. Because of this, it's a no-brainer set to go for on any anemo support you're running, and Lan Yan is no exception. The only times you wouldn't want to run the set are if maybe you're not running damage of an element that you can swirl, or if someone else in your team is already on the set, but generally, as we'll see, most of the times when Lan Yan is a good and honestly really good option, the situations where you'll find yourself putting her in a team basically ever will be when you can swirl with her. It's kind of what makes her good on top of shielding, so most of her teams will have her on the Verdescent Venerer set, and that's what I can highly recommend. Now, as far as other sets go though, if the Verdescent Venerer set wouldn't buff the damage that your team is doing, or if it's on someone else, then you could just go for another generic support set, like the Scroll set, which will still give your team buffs even though you're not from Natlan, just a smaller amount, or the Noblesse Oblige set if you burst every rotation. The Hero set can be particularly interesting if you're running Lan Yan with a anemo carry and want to give them a bit of a damage bonus. Keep in mind that the Tenacity of the Millis set won't be ideal, as the buffs won't last long since your skill doesn't do damage from off field. Outside of that, while I typically can recommend mix and matching 2P sets to go for substats on certain characters where stats are valuable, for Lan Yan, even though you care about her stats, you really care more about how much you're buffing your team, so I highly recommend running a supportive set. This means going the Verdescent Venerer set 99% of the time, with the other supportive sets I mentioned being viable if the Verdescent Venerer set is not right for you. Next up, for the stats you want on Lan Yan, here's what you need to know. Firstly, I'll say that for like 99% of players, building her is very straightforward. Because Lan Yan is a character who gives you a lot of utility just by using her shield and buffing your team, you can get a lot of this value very easily without needing any specific stats. To make your shield stronger, you will look for attack percent on your pieces, and you don't really have to worry about that much else. In fact, for most players, I recommend going for attack percent on your sands, goblet, and circlet, and looking for it on your substats as well to just get the tankiest shield possible. Now, regarding energy recharge and Lan Yan's burst, while it's nice for the grouping and some bonus damage, it's really not the biggest deal if you're using it every rotation or not. Because of this, it's not essential to have energy recharge on Lan Yan, and it also isn't even essential to use her burst unless you're running a set that requires it, like Noblesse Oblige, or have her 4th constellation where it can become more valuable if you can use the elemental mastery on other party members that you're running. Because of this, I typically recommend just using your burst whenever you have it, or even ignoring it altogether if you don't care about the displacement. And energy recharge is a fine substat, but not what you're going to be prioritizing, and you can keep your Lan Yan on a really simple and low investment full attack build just to get a stronger shield, buff your team, and be a useful support that you don't have to overly complicate. With that said, if you want to use her burst every rotation, then you can build more energy recharge, again being more valuable with her 4th constellation, or just if you don't care too much about your shield strength and want her to do more damage. In fact, if you do want to burst every rotation, Lan Yan can need really high amounts of energy recharge, like upwards of 200% depending on your team. Because of this, it's typically recommended, as mentioned, to burst either every other rotation or kind of just whenever necessary or available, but you can need a lot of ER if you do want to spam her burst every rotation. Outside of that, if all you care about is Lan Yan's personal damage and don't care about her shield strength, then offensive stats are going to be what you're looking for. Attack percent is still nice, and so is energy recharge, but on top of that, you'll be looking for crit rate and crit damage as substats, and also on your circlet. Outside of that, you can also consider an anemo damage bonus goblet, or still stay with attack percent if you want to maintain some shield strength. In my experience, this is something I would mostly do if you're looking to go for higher investment, don't care about your shield strength, and maybe are running someone like Bennett there too to give you a stronger shield and already a lot of attack, which can make you deal more damage to the point where building for more damage damage might actually be the best for you. With that in mind, building her as a low investment shield bot is easier, but knowing that you can go for more damage if you want to is worth pointing out. Outside of that, a crit rate circlet can also be viable if you are running the Favonius Codex and want to trigger it more reliably. Lastly, for Lan Yan's on-field playstyle, where you are swirling as many elements as possible and using her as an on-field driver, then you will opt instead for an Elemental Mastery build, looking for EM on all of your pieces. This means trying to get EM substats on your Flower and Feather, and running an Elemental Mastery main stat on your Sands, Goblet, and Circlet. For her general playstyle though, as I said, building attack percent on your main stats or substats is going to be the general best build and recommendation. Alright, now next up, let's talk about Lan Yan's best weapons. Here it's important to mention that Lan Yan has a few good supportive catalyst options, with her general go-to weapon being a really strong free-to-play choice. This weapon is none other than the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers, which I've mentioned earlier in the video, and it's a weapon that you're probably already familiar with if you've watched some of my other guides. This is just a very solid supportive weapon that everyone can get and refine for free because it's a 3-star. Now, while its stats are low and you will lose out on some shielding for Lan Yan because it has a low base attack and doesn't give you the most stats, it more than makes up for it by giving a character in your party 48% attack for 10 seconds. While the uptime on this thing isn't 100%, the damage that you're giving to the next character you're swapping into, provided they're an attack scaler, is very high, and getting a useful weapon that gives you utility is honestly very hard. It's difficult to give a character more buffs, and being a catalyst weapon type actually helps out Lan Yan a lot, as we talked about earlier. Part of the reason why is because you have access to supportive weapons that give you even more buffs than what you get from your artifact set and your kit in general, and Thrilling Tales is a prime example of this. 48% attack is more than you get on a main stat. It's really a lot, and it's nice to give to a carry, provided you are running an attack scaler in your team. So the main caveats here are that 1, you want to make sure you have an attack scaling damage dealer in your team to be able to use Thrilling Tales efficiently, and also to make sure that you're swapping into them right after Lan Yan. This isn't too hard to do if you just go to Lan Yan before your main DPS, or even adjust your party order so that it's natural for you. But if you're not running an attack scaler, or this isn't something that you're comfortable doing, or maybe it just doesn't work for you, then don't worry, as there are many other options you can use. Firstly, Sitlali's signature weapon is a great buffing choice. While you probably didn't pull this weapon just for Lan Yan, if you do have it, it is good for her as well, as it will give considerable buffs to your team. In fact, it will give your active character 28% damage bonus, making it your potential best in slot. So if you have it available, definitely use it on Lan Yan, as it generally will be your strongest buffing option. Outside of that, other supportive options can work as well. Favonius Codex can be great, mostly for the energy it's giving your team, so there's some utility there. You can build less ER on your other party members, on top of giving your Lan Yan energy, which isn't essential, but is nice if you have her C4, or just want to use her burst. Outside of that, Nahida's weapon can work to give your team a bit of elemental mastery, and Prototype Amber can also be viable if you need healing in your team, if you're not running another healer and really just want it for comfort, although generally I wouldn't use it over the other options unless you're really desperate for more healing. And Hokushin Ring can be good when paired alongside a lot of electro characters, but keep in mind you either want to be on field or swapping into her from time to time to trigger the weapon's effect that can be triggered from off field. Lastly, if you want to just increase Lan Yan's elemental mastery when you are playing her as an on-field driver, then EM stat sticks can work as well, like once again Nahida's or Sitlali's weapon, Sacrificial Fragments, Wandering Evenstar, or others. Lastly, if all you care about is shield strength, an attack percent stat stick can help give you that, but I won't recommend that as much as a weapon that provides you with utility or damage buffs. Alright, now next up, let's talk about Lan Yan's Constellations and how good they are. Well, as we saw earlier in the video, both Lan Yan's C2 and C4 are very interesting. To go in order though, firstly, Lan Yan's C1 will just give her a bit more damage from her skill, and then her C2 is maybe the main one I want to talk about. What this constellation does is the following. When you have Lan Yan's shield active, and your active party member is doing normal attack damage, 40% of the shield's damage absorption will be restored up to its original maximum absorption. This can be triggered once every 2 seconds, and what this means in practice is that your shield's health will basically constantly replenish up to how much it has as a maximum as you're doing normal attacks on your active character. This means that if you're taking damage and your shield is getting lower on health, it's maybe about to break, well, you can kind of heal your shield back up and make it last much longer. This makes your shield a lot stronger in practice, as you can restore your shield back up as you're doing normal attacks. Now, keep in mind though that while this can make your shield a lot stronger, it is still susceptible to breaking if you get hit by one strong attack that can just one-shot your shield, or if you get hit multiple times in a row without having the chance to normal attack. For those reasons, its exact value can vary, but honestly, having a shield that can refresh is honestly quite nice for comfort, and this is definitely a really good constellation as far as defensive utility goes to make your shield stronger, provided you are normal attacking. While I don't think this constellation is necessary to make her shield good, it does genuinely help to make it more comfortable and stronger overall, so definitely a good constellation. Outside of that, C3 and 5 increase your talent levels, with C3 in particular increasing your skill level, which is nice for just a stronger shield, but not necessary. Next up for Lan Yan C4, this one will give all of her party members a 60 EM buff for 12 seconds after using her burst. This gives her burst another reason to be used, on top of the little bit of grouping and damage that it originally has. While Lan Yan's burst is not necessary to use per se, now giving a 60 EM buff to your team makes it much more valuable to use in teams that can benefit from this EM buff, meaning reaction-based team comps. This is just a nice constellation for a support character that will give her another buff. I do believe that if you have your C4, this is when you might want to start trying to use your burst more often, ideally every rotation, but this can depend on your team. 60 EM isn't the biggest thing in the world, but it is a nice bonus that definitely adds up, especially if you're triggering valuable reactions. Another buff is always welcome, so C4 is definitely a good one. Lastly, for Lan Yan C6, this will give her another charge of her skill, allowing you to basically cast another shield if it gets broken, or also allow you to play in some shorter rotations. Generally though, it's just another charge for comfort. It's not the biggest deal, but it can definitely help out if you need another shield or end up swapping into Lan Yan very often. Overall, I think Lan Yan's constellations are quite nice because they don't feel like they're needed. They're definitely not mandatory, but she does have some pretty good ones, like C2 genuinely makes your shield a lot stronger, C4 gives you an EM buff, which is just a nice welcome bonus, and C6 gives you another charge of your skill, which is more or less valuable depending on your team and how you're playing, but it's always nice to have another. With that said, I don't think Lan Yan is a constellation dependent character. I think she's really strong at C0, which is genuinely nice for a new 4-star character, so really good even if you just have one copy, but getting better with certain constellations, like notably her C2 and C4. Alright, now with that out of the way, let's talk about Lan Yan's best teams. Now here it's important to emphasize that Lan Yan is going to be a very flexible defensive option in any team that wants a 2-in-1 anemo support and shielder. What this means in practice is that she can be slotted in as a defensive flex slot for any team doing damage of a swirlable element, namely Pyro, Hydro, Cryo, or Electro, having these elements as either your main DPS or even just off-field characters that deal damage of said elements that can be swirled and buffed through Lan Yan. Because of this, she is very flexible, and it's kind of a blank canvas in terms of there's really so much you can do, and I can't cover every single team you can use of those respective elements. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some general guidelines, some example teams, but know that any team with damage dealers of said elements that want an anemo support to come in, swirl, and buff your damage through the Verdescent Venerer set, and also act as your form of defensive utility, a shield which can be very valuable for certain characters, is where Lan Yan shines. She can also be used in some other teams which I'll mention, but for now, let's begin. So as I said, Lan Yan can be paired alongside Pyro carries. There really are a lot. She helps Linny, for example, charge shot while shielded, and is a great shielder for him, as the Pyro damage buff you're gaining can help both him and other Pyro characters you may be running. Outside of that, basically any generic Pyro DPS can run Lan Yan as a form of defensive utility, and Arlecchino in particular is a character that I really like with Lan Yan. While Arlecchino has a ton of really strong teams and options already, Lan Yan can be a really good option for Arlecchino. While a shielder like Sitlali would be the best for Arlecchino's premium melt team, as a 4-star shielder, Lan Yan can shine in other Arlecchino teams, notably in a mono Pyro team, where she can give your Arlecchino more damage than even someone like Zhongli. If you need a shielder, which is very nice for Arlecchino as she's a character who can't really be healed outside of her burst, Lan Yan can be an excellent defensive option that I've been enjoying running alongside Arlecchino. So definitely a great 4-star for her. Outside of Pyro carries and Pyro teams, Lan Yan can also be used alongside Hydro characters, notably being yet another addition to a Neuvillette team. Neuvillette keeps getting strong supports patch after patch, and Lan Yan is no exception. She's a great shielder for a C0 Neuvillette who really values that resistance to interruption so that he can beam away without fear of getting hit. Lan Yan is going to be a 2-in-1 anemo buffer and shielder here, being great if you don't already have an anemo character in your Neuvillette team, and being one of his best options because once again, you really can make use of the buffs that she gives you. Now keep in mind that Thrilling Tales won't be as efficient here unless you have an attack scaler in your team, but you can just run another supportive weapon like even Favonius and get some value there. Outside of that, even someone like Farina will get buffed by the Hydro Swirl, and you can even run Lan Yan in a Mualani team if you want defensive utility. Now obviously Mualani has a ton of different options in her teams, but Lan Yan acts as just another option if you want some defensive utility. Moving on, as I said, you can run her in Cryo teams with a Cryo carry like Ganyu or Risley. The defensive utility for Ganyu, for example, can be quite nice to allow you to shield, while also being able to swirl Cryo, Pyro, or both, depending on your rotation. And she can also be played in Freeze teams as well, or even mono cryo if once again you need a defensive utility and an emo bundled up in the same slot. Outside of that, Lan Yan can be ran alongside electro carries in either aggravate teams or even electro charged taser ones. Here you want to be sure to try to swirl both electro and hydro, and what I'll say about these teams is that while the aggravate teams can have other forms of defensive utility like Kirara or Baiju or even just a healer, if you are running an offensive Dendro slot, then having an anemo shielder is quite nice for the same reasons as other teams, and also running a shield does enable you to run, for example, the Harbinger of Dawn on a sword character if you are staying above 90% HP and don't have better options. Generally though, she works in aggravate teams as a 2-in-1, and she can also work in taser teams to swirl both hydro and electro. I will say that if your taser team already has defensive utility like maybe Beidou and Xingqiu, then going for an offensive anemo character like Sucrose can be more favored, at least from on field, because they give you more buffs. But if you value defensive utility and maybe don't have a healer, then Lan Yan can work nicely either from off field with another on field driver, or even on field building full elemental mastery and doing some damage from her swirls. She can also be an on field driver for other teams such as aggravate for the same reasons as previously mentioned. Lan Yan can also be used alongside an anemo carry, and while you won't get the benefit of the Verdescent Venerer set, she will give you some anemo particles and a comfy shield, thrilling tales, and can also run the hero set for some anemo damage bonus once you swirl. In these teams, your Lan Yan can also do decent personal damage, so if you want to maximize her damage, this is kind of the team for it, as you'll have buffers such as Farazan and Bennett, increasing your anemo DPS's damage that you're running, and Lan Yan as well. In a team like this, you can either build to maximize your shield if it's valuable for example, your Wanderer, or if it's strong enough, you can even build a bit more damage for your Lan Yan, as it can be more valuable in a team like this because of how many buffs you're getting. I will say that while Xiao already has premium teams with someone like Shen Yun, and Wanderer also has great buffers like even Farina you can run, and many others, if you are looking for a shielder, Lan Yan is a decent option because running Scroll will buff your anemo damage provided you're swirling, you can have a weapon that buffs you, and a pretty tanky shield even at C0. Because of this, while obviously other options exist for Wanderer like Toma, especially with his C6 and also Layla, Lan Yan works as a surprisingly decent C0 option here alongside an anemo DPS that can value the shield. Nothing game breaking, but another good option. And so overall, the sky really is the limit for Lan Yan. There's really so many teams you can use, and I really am pleased with her versatility. I think she's good, especially for characters that can value the defensive utility, that can make use of it and really need resistance interruption, or if you're just someone who values the comfort on top of wanting the buffs that an anemo character can give you. And so yeah, overall Lan Yan is a 4-star that I'm very happy with. I'm not including a DPS showcase because she's just a pretty generic support, but she's a good one, great at C0, great without the most investment, and not someone that you absolutely need to get. Her value depends on your teams and stuff, but if you're looking for a strong shielder and an anemo character, then I can recommend Lan Yan as a good option. I'm glad to see more 4-stars that are good. We've been getting a few strong ones recently, and that always makes me happy. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed. If there's anything I want to add or any corrections I want to make, it will be in a pinned comment, as she is a new character. Anyways, I hope this guide was helpful. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.